In the late 19th century, a man's worth was measured by the ink on a page. The census was the ultimate ledger of existence, a meticulous, handwritten inventory of a nation's soul. In 1895, as the United States pushed through the final years of the Gilded Age, the state of New York conducted a mid-decade census intended to capture the exploding population of its industrial heartlands. But in one specific administrative block, District 14, encompassing a series of isolated mill towns and river settlements along the upper Hudson, something went wrong. The official state ledgers, bound in heavy leather and preserved in the damp archives of Albany, show a statistical impossibility. In a region home to thousands of working-class families, the 1,895 census recorded 0 births for the preceding 12 months. Local parish records, however, tell a different story. They document the baptisms of over 300 infants born within that same window. For the state, these children did not exist. For the families, they were the center of the world. Records suggest that this wasn't a clerical error, but a deliberate omission. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand why 300 lives were scrubbed from the historical record, we have to look at the atmosphere of the 1890s. This was an era of profound transition. The horse was giving way to the steam engine. The lantern was being extinguished by the incandescent bulb. It was also a time of intense social engineering. The science of the era was obsessed with categorization, measurement, and the emerging, often dark, field of eugenics. In the river towns of District 14, the local economy was dominated by the massive textile and paper mills that lined the water's edge. These were company towns. In the truest sense, the company owned the houses, the stores, and often the local officials. Some historians believe that the 1,895 census was the first time a private interest successfully overrode a public record. The census takers were not government careerists. They were often local appointees, men whose livelihoods depended on the very mill owners they were supposed to regulate. And in the spring of 1895, a directive was issued that changed the way they saw the youngest members of their community. The first signs of the discrepancy didn't come from the state, but from the women who lived in the shadow of the mills. Midwives in the late 19th century were the unofficial archivists of the working class. They kept their own ledgers, dog-eared notebooks filled with names, weights, and the hour of birth. One such midwife was a woman named Margaret Vance. Her personal papers, recovered by a local historical society in the 1970s, reveal a growing sense of unease during that census year. She noted that when the census taker arrived at the tenements of the riverfront, he didn't ask about the children in the cradles. He asked about the capacity of the household and the productivity of the laborers. When Vance pointed out that several of her recent deliveries were being bypassed, the official reportedly told her that the state had no interest in those who could not yet pull a lever. It was a cold, industrial logic, and that's when things began to shift. The omission of the children wasn't just a matter of ignored paperwork, it was a matter of legal protection. In 1895, child labor laws were beginning to gain traction in the Northeast. New regulations were being debated that would require a state-verified birth certificate for any child to begin work in a factory. By ensuring that 300 children were never officially recorded in the census, some believed the mill owners were creating a shadow workforce, a generation of children who, on paper, were younger than they actually were, or who simply didn't exist in the eyes of the law. This would allow them to be brought into the mills years ahead of schedule, with no paper trail to alert the burgeoning labor inspectors. But as researchers looked closer at the specific names omitted from the list, they found a pattern that didn't fit a simple labor skimming scheme. The ignored children weren't random. They all lived in a specific proximity to the river's effluent pipes. This discovery, made by an investigative archivist in the 1930s, suggests a more unsettling possibility. In the 1890s, the mills were discharging massive amounts of chemical waste directly into the Hudson. The river was a source of life, but it was also a source of toxicity. Local health reports from that year show a spike in respiratory fevers and skin ailments among newborns in District 14. If the state had officially recorded those 300 births, they would have been forced to record the subsequent infant mortality rates. By ignoring the births, they were effectively ignoring a public health crisis that could have threatened the industrial output of the region. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Among the archives of the New York State Board of Health, a secondary ledger was found in the 1960s, mislabeled as a series of agricultural surveys. It was a parallel census of District 14, conducted in secret during the same months of 1895. Unlike the official record, this ledger was exhaustive. It contained the names of every one of the 300 children, but it didn't just list their names. It contained detailed observations of their physical development, the color of their eyes, and the responsiveness of their nervous systems. It wasn't a census at all, it was a study. There is no clear consensus on who commissioned this shadow record, but the depth of the detail suggests it was conducted by medical professionals with significant funding. The children of 1895 weren't being ignored because they were unimportant. They were being monitored as part of a controlled observation that the state was never meant to see. This realization brings us to the personal stories of those who lived through the gap of 1895. For the parents, the lack of an official record created a sense of profound vulnerability. Without a census entry, these children were ineligible for later benefits, and many faced difficulties proving their citizenship or age when they reached adulthood. One family, the O'Sullivans, had 3 children during that period, all of whom were omitted from the state records. In a letter written by the mother, Catherine, to her sister in 1897, she described a grey man who visited their home once a month. He didn't come to help. He came to measure the children's fingers and check the clarity of their speech. He never identified himself, and he never asked for money. He simply observed and left. Catherine's letters describe a community under a strange, silent siege, a place where the children were being watched by someone who didn't want the world to know they existed. The escalation of the mystery occurred in the winter of 1898. Just as the 300 were reaching the age of 3, a critical milestone for the cognitive development studies of the time, a series of fires broke out in the local parish offices of District 14. In 3 separate towns, the baptismal records for the year 1895 were destroyed within the same 48-hour period. These weren't accidental mill fires. They were targeted strikes on the only surviving evidence of the children's existence. The local police, largely funded by the mill owners, made no arrests. With the parish records gone and the state census already blank, the children of 1895 were effectively erased from history. What happened next remains unclear, but the few surviving documents suggest that the study was entering its final, most aggressive phase. By 1900, the riverfront in District 14 had become a place of whispers. The children who had been bypassed in the census were now 5 years old. They were starting to work the light tasks in the paper mills, but their presence was always kept in the shadows. Visitors to the mills reported seeing small, quiet figures who moved with an eerie efficiency, disappearing into the steam whenever a stranger approached. A young journalist from New York City, attempting to write an exposé on child labor, visited the district in 1902. He noted in his unfinished manuscript that the children of the 1895 cohort seemed strangely uniform in their height and gait. He also noted that they were remarkably healthy, a stark contrast to the sickly children born in the years before and after them. It was as if the monitoring of the grey men had involved more than just observation. Some historians believe that the children were being given experimental supplements or fortified rations as part of the secret study, an attempt to create a more resilient industrial laborer. But as the investigative journalist prepared to leave the district, he was warned by a local doctor to drop the story. The doctor told him that the children of 1895 weren't just a workforce, they were the property of the valley. This phrase, property of the valley, appears in several other fragments from the era, always in reference to the 1895 cohort. It suggests a level of control that goes beyond simple labor exploitation. It points toward a turning point where a group of human beings was treated as a proprietary biological asset, and that's when the entire project and the children themselves began to vanish from the public eye. The identity of the grey men and the architects of the 1895 omission began to crystallize in the 1920s, when a trunk of private correspondence was discovered in the attic of a demolished manor house in Poughkeepsie. The letters belonged to Dr. Silas Thorne, a prominent surgeon who had consulted for several major industrial foundations. In his writing, Thorne frequently referred to an initiative called the Hudson Lyceum for biological efficiency. He described it not as a school, but as a living laboratory, where the variables of human development could be isolated from the corruptive influences of the state. Thorne's letters suggest that the 300 children were the Lyceum's primary subjects. By ensuring they were never recorded in the 1895 census, the Lyceum effectively stripped them of their legal identity, making them invisible to any oversight beyond the mill walls. But that wasn't the strangest part. Thorne's notes contain detailed descriptions of what he called the regiment, a specific diet and environmental routine imposed on the 1,895 cohort. While other children in the district suffered from rickets and tuberculosis, the 300 were reportedly fed a fortified mash produced in the mill's own laboratories and were required to sleep in ventilated dormitories that utilized experimental air filtration systems. Some historians believe this was an early, crude attempt at human optimization, an industrialist's dream of creating a worker who never tired and never fell ill. But the Lyceum wasn't just interested in their health. They were interested in their loyalty. The children were raised in a vacuum of information, taught only the skills required for the looms and the vats, and told that the outside was a place of disease and chaos. They were a community within a community, a silent workforce that moved through the town like ghosts. The persistent void in the official records became even more glaring during the 1905 New York State Census. By this time, the children were 10 years old. In any other district, a group of 300 10-year-olds would be a dominant demographic in the local schools and playgrounds. Yet, the 1,905 ledgers for District 14 show a continued, systematic undercounting. Census workers were allegedly instructed to categorize any unidentified youths found in the mill tenements as transient lodgers or seasonal laborers, a classification that avoided the need for birth certificates or parentage records. This suggests that the Lyceum's influence had grown, reaching into the very heart of the state's administrative machinery. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 1912, a localized outbreak of scarlet fever ripped through the upper Hudson Valley. In the surrounding towns, the mortality rate among children was staggering. But in the mill towns of District 14, the 1,895 cohort remained untouched. Public health records from that year, which survived the parish fires, show that while the rest of the community struggled, the Lyceum youths, now 17 years old, exhibited a near-total immunity to the disease. This anomaly drew the attention of a young epidemiologist from New York City, Dr. Elias Vance. Vance attempted to gain access to the mill clinics to study the teenagers, but he was blocked by private security at every turn. In his personal journals, Vance wrote of seeing the youths through the factory gates. They stand with a posture that is not humanly natural, rigid, symmetrical, and eerily still. They do not speak to one another, yet they move as a single organism. Vance's observations point toward a turning point in the experiment. The 1,895 cohort was no longer just a group of healthy workers. They were becoming something else, a biological unit that seemed to possess a collective consciousness, or, at the very least, a highly conditioned synchronization. But as the world moved toward the Great War, the Lyceum's control was suddenly threatened by a force even more powerful than industrial wealth, the federal government's need for soldiers. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, and the Selective Service Act required every man between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for the draft. For the first time, the invisible men of 1,895 were forced to step out of the shadows and into the light of federal scrutiny, and that's when things began to shift. The recruitment records for District 14 from 1,917 are a chaotic mess of contradictions. When the local draft boards attempted to process the men from the mill towns, they found nearly 300 individuals with no birth records, no baptismal certificates, and no entries in the 1895 or 1,905 censuses. The military, desperate for manpower, initially ignored the discrepancies and processed them, as documented by affidavit. However, once these men reached the training camps, the reports from their commanding officers became increasingly strange. One colonel at Camp Upton wrote that the recruits from District 14 were the finest physical specimens in the division, yet they possess a temperament that is utterly vacuous. They follow orders with a chilling, mechanical precision, but they show no initiative, no fear, and no camaraderie with the other men. But that wasn't the strangest part of their military service. Of the nearly 250 men from the 1,895 cohort who were shipped to the Western Front, the casualty records are almost non-existent, While other units were decimated in the trenches of the Meuse-Argonne, the men from District 14 seemed to possess a statistical impossibility of survival. Some historians believe they were kept in reserve for specialized, undisclosed tasks, while others suggest that their physical conditioning allowed them to endure conditions that killed others. But a more unsettling theory emerged after the armistice. When the surviving soldiers returned to the United States in 1919, they didn't go back to their families. They didn't even return to the towns of District 14. They simply vanished from the transport manifests between the port of Hoboken and the rail yards of the Hudson Valley. This mass disappearance triggered a brief, frantic investigation by the Department of Justice. A federal agent named Franklin Thorne, no relation to the doctor, was tasked with finding the missing veterans. He visited the mills in District 14 and found that the Lyceum had been shuttered. The laboratories were empty. The dormitories had been converted back into standard tenements. The grey men were gone. Thorne interviewed the parents of the 1,895 cohort, but he was met with a wall of silence. The mothers, who had once written of grey men measuring their children's fingers, now claimed they had never had children at all. It was as if a collective erasure had been enacted, not just on the paper records, but on the memories of the community itself. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Thorne eventually tracked a series of bank transfers from the Lyceum's parent foundation to a remote facility in the Adirondack Mountains, a former sanatorium that had been purchased in 1918. He attempted to serve a warrant on the facility, but by the time he arrived, the site was a smoking ruin. A fire had consumed the entire complex only hours before his arrival. In the embers, Thorne found fragments of medical charts and what appeared to be thousands of glass slides. The slides were blank, but the charts contained a recurring phrase. Phase 4. Integration. There is no clear consensus on what integration meant, but some believe it was the final step in the Lyceum's plan to disperse their optimized subjects back into the general population to see if their traits would persist or dominate in the next generation. The aftermath of the 1,895 census mystery left a permanent scar on the administrative history of New York. In the 1930s, when the Social Security Act was passed, thousands of people in the Hudson Valley found they were ineligible for benefits because they didn't officially exist. Among them were the survivors of District 14, now in their 40s. When they attempted to reconstruct their identities, they were met with a maze of lost files and redacted parish records. The state eventually issued a series of special identity certificates to resolve the issue, but these documents contained a peculiar stamp in the lower right corner, a small, stylized letter L inside a circle. It was the mark of the Lyceum. As we look back through the layers of evidence, the story of the 300 children feels less like a census error and more like a blueprint for a future that never fully arrived. It was an experiment in human engineering that operated in the cracks of a shifting society, utilizing the anonymity of the industrial age to hide its tracks. The children were ignored by the state because the state was never meant to own them. They were a proprietary generation, a biological asset built for a century of total industry. But as the investigation moved into the modern era, a final, chilling piece of evidence surfaced in the genetic records of the Hudson Valley. In the age of genetic mapping, the secrets of the past are no longer confined to the brittle pages of a census ledger. They are written in our blood. In the early 2000s, a team of population geneticists, conducting a routine study of hereditary markers in the Northeast, stumbled upon a statistical anomaly that they couldn't explain. Within a narrow geographic corridor of the upper Hudson Valley, the exact footprint of the old District 14, they found a specific, highly conserved cluster of genetic traits that defied the standard migration patterns of the late 19th century. These markers, related to high-efficiency metabolic regulation and unusually robust immune responses, were present in nearly 10% of the local population. But when the researchers tried to trace the genealogy of these individuals back to the 1,895 census, they hit a dead end. For hundreds of families, the line of descent simply vanished at the river's edge. It was as if a new branch of the human family tree had appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, in a valley that officially recorded no births. This modern discovery has forced a re-evaluation of the social security gap of the 1930s. Those special identity certificates marked with the stylized L were long dismissed as a bureaucratic quirk, a simple solution for undocumented laborers. But when a digital archivist in Albany cross-referenced the serial numbers of those certificates with the modern genetic study, a chilling pattern emerged. Every individual who possessed a Lyceum certificate was a direct descendant of the 1,895 cohort. And that's when they realized the L wasn't just a stamp of origin, it was a tracking code. The state, it seems, had never truly lost track of the 300 children. They had simply moved the surveillance from the public census to a private, lifetime monitoring program that lasted well into the 1960s. But the most haunting discovery wasn't in the archives, it was in the biology of the living. Records suggest that the 1,895 cohort lived, on average, 12 years longer than their peers in neighboring districts. They were remarkably resistant to the chronic illnesses that defined the mid-20th century. Heart disease, cancer, and respiratory failure were almost non-existent in the group. Some historians believe that Phase 4, integration, was a resounding success. The Lyceum hadn't just built a better worker, they had engineered a biological resilience that was being passed down through the generations. In the quiet towns of the Hudson Valley, the descendants of the 300 are often described as sturdy and even-tempered, individuals who excel in high-stress professions like engineering, surgery, and late-night manufacturing. They are the perfect citizens of a modern industrial state. But when the geneticists looked closer at the optimized markers, they found something that the Lyceum may not have intended. The same genetic cluster that provided such physical robustness was also linked to a significant reduction in certain areas of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with divergent thinking and rebellion. The descendants were physically superior, but they were also statistically more likely to exhibit a high level of social compliance. They were, in the words of one researcher, biologically predisposed to the status quo. This revelation has sparked a fierce debate among ethicists. Was the 1,895 omission a criminal conspiracy to exploit children, or was it a visionary, albeit ruthless, attempt to accelerate human evolution? There is no clear consensus, but the fact remains that 300 lives were sacrificed as the raw material for a future they were never allowed to understand. The physical remnants of the Lyceum are now almost entirely gone. The mills of District 14 were shuttered in the 1970s, replaced by shopping malls and suburban housing tracts. The effluent pipes that once pumped chemical waste into the Hudson have been capped and buried under layers of asphalt. Yet, for those who know where to look, the gap of 1,895 is still visible. It's visible in the town squares, where the names of the WWI veterans are missing from the bronze plaques. It's visible in the local cemeteries, where the headstones for those born in 1895 are often unmarked or placed in separate, secluded sections. And it's visible in the faces of the people who still live in the shadow of the valley, people who move with a certain unsettling precision and who never seem to fall ill. One such descendant is a man named Thomas Vance, the great-grandson of the epidemiologist who first noticed the anomaly in 1912. Thomas grew up in one of the old mill towns, and he still possesses his grandfather's private medical bag. Tucked inside the lining of the bag is a single, glass slide, the only one that survived the Adirondack fire. It is not blank. Under a modern microscope, the slide reveals a dense, crystalline structure that doesn't correspond to any known human tissue. It looks like a hybrid of biological cell and mineral deposit, of vitrified organic matter. Thomas claims that he sometimes hears a faint, rhythmic humming when he stands near the river at night, a sound that feels less like a noise and more like a vibration in his bones. It is a reminder that the monitoring may not have ended with his grandfather's generation. The 1,895 census remains the only mid-decade ledger in New York history with such a massive, localized discrepancy. The official explanation continues to be clerical oversight during a period of rapid industrial transition. But the blank pages tell a different story. They tell of a moment when the state stepped back and allowed private interest to treat human life as a laboratory. They tell of 300 children who were born into a world that refused to acknowledge their existence, and who grew up to be the invisible architects of the century that followed. What happened next remains unclear, as the Lyceum's ultimate goal was never fully realized, or perhaps it was realized so perfectly that we can no longer see it. As we look at the seamless, high-efficiency world of the 21st century, we have to wonder how many other gaps exist in our history. How many other populations have been bypassed by the census, monitored by the grey men, and integrated into our society without our knowledge? The 1,895 cohort reminds us that the record is not just a reflection of reality, it is a tool of control. By deciding who is counted and who is ignored, the state and the corporation define the boundaries of what is human. The children of 1,895 were the first to be removed from that boundary, but they were certainly not the last. The Hudson River continues to flow, a dark, rhythmic presence that carries the secrets of the valley out to the Atlantic. The paper mills are silent, and the grey men have long since faded into the mist. But the 300 children are still here. They are in our offices, our hospitals, and our neighborhoods. They are the quiet, efficient, and healthy individuals who never question the system, because they are, in a very real sense, a product of it. The 1,895 census ignored them, the state erased them, and history forgot them. But in the silence of the Hudson Valley, the experiment continues, pulsing through the veins of a generation that doesn't know it was engineered. The ledger is still open. The ink is still dry. And somewhere in the archives of Albany, there is a missing volume that contains the truth about District 14. Until that volume is found, the 1,895 census will remain a blank spot on the map of the American soul, a haunting reminder that some lives are written in pencil, easily erased, while others are etched in a code that we are only just beginning to decipher.